Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel on development charges, the case for and against. I'm Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities here at U of T, and I'm going to be the moderator for today. Normally I just introduce the moderator, but I have a bigger job today. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank IMFG's external funders, Avana Capital, Maytree, the Neptus Foundation, the City of Toronto, and the regions of Halton, York, Durham, and Peel. Thanks also to our staff at IMFG, Cass Foreman and Piali Roy, and all the people here at Massey who helped organize this event and are running it for us today. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter, I can never do that one, our Twitter handle, our X handle, is at IMFG Toronto. Who would have thought we could fill a room talking about development charges? But they certainly have been in the news a lot lately, including in this morning's Globe and Mail. There was an article on development charges in Ontario and BC. Mostly, what we're hearing about is Ontario and BC, where development charges feature largely. And mostly we're talking about affordable housing. So in the context of affordable housing, we're talking about development charges. So we think today's discussion is very timely. Before I introduce our panel to you, though, I'd like to take a few minutes to explain how development charges work and give you a bit of history in Ontario, although there are people in this audience who probably can do this better than I can. But for those of you who don't know much about development charges, I'd like to do a little introduction. Development charges are levies on developers to pay for the growth-related capital costs associated with new development and, in some cases, redevelopment. DCs are used to fund different types of infrastructure: water, wastewater, roads, and related infrastructure, transit, libraries, and the list goes on. So where did they come from? Where did development charges start? Well, prior to 1989, and I do remember this, in Ontario there were really no rules about what municipalities could charge developers to pay for the costs of infrastructure. Planning legislation simply said that municipalities could charge developers as part of the development approval process. Well, not surprisingly, nobody really liked that system. Neither the municipalities nor the developers liked the informality of that arrangement and the uncertainty associated with it. So in 1989, the provincial government passed the first Development Charges Act. This legislation and the regulations set out the details of what municipalities could charge. Municipalities are required to provide a very detailed background study, and some of the people who do these studies are in the audience, on how development charges are calculated. These studies have to provide information on the anticipated growth, where it's going to occur, a forecast of capital expenditures by type of infrastructure, a determination of what portion of those expenditures are growth-related, the standards that will be achieved, and a lot more. These background studies, which are available online, can range from 300 to 400 pages, very detailed analysis. Over time, however, after 1989, developers felt that municipalities were charging too much for development charges and that they were using them to gold plate infrastructure. These complaints led to amendments to the Development Charges Act in 1997, which restricted the types of infrastructure municipalities could levy for, restricted how much of the cost they could levy, so some types of infrastructure were discounted. They made changes to the service standards and how they were calculated, and a whole lot of other changes that reduced what municipalities could charge relative to the 1989 legislation. Since 1997, the pendulum has swung back and forth, from allowing municipalities to charge more for infrastructure to allowing them to charge less. That brings us to today. The most recent changes to the development charges are found in Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. This bill imposes a number of restrictions on development charges that will lower the revenues municipalities can expect to collect from them. I'm not going to go through all the changes, but as an example, there are exemptions from development charges for the creation of affordable residential units and other types of housing. Some people think development charges make housing less affordable and welcome these changes that would reduce the charge. But development charges make it possible for municipalities to pay for the infrastructure needed for new development, and without them, municipalities may have trouble providing this infrastructure. And that's what the Globe and Mail article was about this morning. So we are very lucky today to have two experts who can delve into these issues for us. They have different views, but you'll see they are dressed the same. Ben Dachis and Adam Found. Since their bios were in the invitation and they're on our website, I'm only just going to say a few words about each of them. Ben Dachis is Associate Vice President of Public Affairs for the C.D. Howe Institute and has been at C.D. Howe since 2006. From 2018 to 2019, Ben was the Director of Policy, Budget and Fiscal Planning for the Premier of Ontario. He's also worked for major think tanks in the US and the UK. Not in his bio, but I have to mention it, is Ben's book called A Roadmap to Municipal Reform, Improving Life in Canadian Cities. And I think there is a chapter on development charges in that book. Our second panelist today is Adam Found. Adam is Manager of Corporate Assets at the City of Kawartha Lakes, where he oversees the city's capital planning, capital budgeting, and development charges portfolios. He's Vice President of the Municipal Finance Officers Association and will be President in 2025. Adam is a research fellow at C.D. Howe and part-time faculty at Trent University. And so I always believe in fairness. I have to say something that wasn't in his bio, which are the papers he's written for IMFG. One when he was a graduate student on economies of scale in fire and police services, but more recently, 2 papers on development charges. So we have 2 great experts here to take us through development charges. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. Then I will engage them in a bit of a discussion, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So, Ben.
So thank you very much for the invitation here. It's really worth emphasizing that Adam and I are very good friends. We first met in the basement of the U of T Economics Department, which is a punishment I would impose on very few people other than maybe the 2 of us. But we managed, we survived, and here we are after agreeing on a lot of things. This is the one topic, maybe other topics, we'll see where this goes, that we do have a disagreement on. But it's not like this disagreement that municipal infrastructure needs to be funded. I want to make that clear. We need good infrastructure. The crux of my argument is that there are better ways to finance needed municipal infrastructure. And I want to make that point both in practice, that in practice, especially the way we've done it in Ontario, that we have not really executed very well in terms of translating municipal upfront financing through development charges into infrastructure. But that even if you did believe in that you could execute on this in practice, that you could get stuff built, that the very fundamental premise of paying for infrastructure mostly upfront through development charges is in many cases incorrect. So I'm going to start with how things have worked in practice. Let's see if I can get this going. It's on. Just move on over to the next slide. Yeah, one less. There we go. So this is a quick graph. I'm going to have 2 slides here for you with some numbers. And this first one, looking at Ontario municipal balances in their development charge reserves. The left-hand set of graphs or columns are money in. The right hand is money out. And the blue surprise, surprise, is money in and out for water, and the yellow is money in and out for everything else. And you'll see a couple things that have transpired over time. First is that the amount of DCs collected has really grown in the last couple of years in particular. No surprise. Development charges themselves have increased quite substantially, and the number of applications that are coming in have also increased quite a bit. So revenues in have grown quite a bit. What's happened, though, is that revenue out, which is the hard work of turning that money into real infrastructure, is just not keeping pace. Now, the basic breakdown is that money going out goes into one of two things. One is either hard infrastructure into the ground, the steel, the concrete, of getting stuff built right here, right now, this year. The other part is paying for money that goes back into the operating budget, but it's really for paying off past debt. Is about 2/3 towards going into hard infrastructure. We'll come back to why that number is important a little bit later. But that's the core message, that at least in Ontario, we've seen a lot of money coming in upfront from home buyers, and we'll talk a little bit later about the effect that this kind of upfront financing has on housing prices. But that money is just not being spent into infrastructure that, even though we're paying for the upfront in a lot of cases, we're just not seeing in that year. But that graph is really only looking at Ontario. And I think it's really important to put Ontario's figures into national context. Because every time that a city collects a development charge, like, that money is allocated. You're going to hear that term used a lot when we talk about development charges are allocated. And that's 100% correct. That money that's allocated is a liability. Every dollar that city collects, they have to spend it and put into infrastructure. And what this graph shows is that, looking at the major municipal governments across Canada, Ontario cities really stand out. And Ontario cities have by far the highest development charges in terms of how much of this liability that they've put onto their balance sheets, in terms of how much infrastructure they've collected money for, but have a promise in terms of what they're going to spend. BC cities are high as well, and those numbers would actually be higher if I included Metro Vancouver. But the one group of cities that really stands out in terms of a group of cities that don't have this kind of very large liability are in Quebec. And what's so special about Quebec? First of all, they don't have development charges at all, pretty much. They just got started this year, and there's very, very low levels. But what's also interesting about Quebec is they are arguably the most affordable housing in the country, especially in a city like Montreal, for a very large city. Now, there's a lot that's underlying that. Part of it's also their zoning approvals in terms of allowing a lot of missing middle, and a lot of other policies. But I would make the contention, I can't prove it right now, that's not the point of the debate, that the policy around relatively few development charges is a component of both the relatively low cost of housing there, but also these cities, rather than having large large liabilities, paying for a lot of their infrastructure using debt finance. And you could see that, I won't show the slides here, but Ontario municipalities, when it comes to their net fiscal outlook, much higher finances, cash on the book, cash in the bank, whereas municipalities in Quebec are much more reliant on debt. And most people, when I say that to them, think, that must be terrible. Cities relying on debt. And I'm probably one of the only people out there, I know of a few others out there as well, who go out and cheer them for taking out debt. In Ontario, we've not had that culture of taking out debt to finance municipal infrastructure. But I'm here to say that that is no longer a four-letter word. In cases where you're paying for a long-lived asset, you may want to rely on debt. And that gets to my theoretical point, which is that what I want you to do right now is I want you to think about a family. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's my family. I've got a 4-year-old at home, and we bought our house, and we want to live there for 15 to 20 years. And most families, unless they're reliant on the bank of mom and dad, are going to be taking out a mortgage. They're going to pay for their house over the life in which they're going to be there. And that's how we can encourage people to get a home, get into a house that, maybe they got one 4-year-old right now, but maybe one's going to come next year or the year after that. They want to build, buy an asset that's bigger for their needs right now, but over the lifetime is going to work for them. And Adam's point about some of his work about fiscal externalities, he'll get into that. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Is if you need that house, you need a big enough house that's going to last for your lifetime. How do you pay for it? And the way that we do it for households is allow them to take out a mortgage, take out debt. But when cities think about a lot of their infrastructure, they're not doing it like that. When we think about water, for example, I'm going to focus a lot on water because at least outside of the city of Toronto, in Ontario, it is by far the largest single item. Roughly about half of development charges outside of the city of Toronto. When we think about these large upfront, decades-long assets, we should be thinking about financing them over the lifetime in which households are going to be using sewage system, water treatment facilities. Paying for this all up front through development charges is the equivalent of telling our families that you have to pay for your house up front. But that's not how we structure things. That's not how we encourage people to get into the housing market. People use debt to be able to afford a house right here, right now. And it's not the fairness argument that's a fairness argument. But let me give you an economic argument. And it's that households have idiosyncratic risk. What do I mean by that? The people in the family could get sick. They may have to move. Things in their life cycle may change very suddenly. And when we take debt, that municipalities are a utility, and I'm going to come back to the concept of utility. If we take that debt that they might have taken out and instead put that onto home buyers, that's actually not a good deal for us as a society. Municipal governments, utilities can pool this debt. They can pool this debt, and we see the evidence that they pay lower interest rates than households, say 2-3% for cities compared to 5-6% if you're lucky for a mortgage. And not only that, cities are able to take out this debt for 20-year terms compared to households that are taking it on 5-year terms. So there are multiple arguments as to why pooling our financing of infrastructure at the municipal level, at the utility level, makes a lot more sense than having this bill be paid for up front. How am I doing on time? I got about 1 minute. So I'm only going to get to this one last point about something that if I go to an IMFG event, I always must do, and it's talk about accrual accounting. It's worth the minute. It's worth the minute. I went too far in my slides. So what the key point is that graph that I showed you of that looked at cash in and cash out is just that. Cash in collected and cash out. But let's think about what that cash out really is getting you. When it's cash out that's going to pay off debt, that's good. That's what we want, effectively. We are the city has taken out debt that is, for a theory, a long-lived asset. But when we're putting money into the ground, or money into steel that goes into the ground, that is, in theory, going to last decades. And so that household is paying for something up front in that previous graph, but the real benefit is going to come much, much later. It's going to come over 20 years. What we should be doing is, in order to create intergenerationally fair spending, is really look at that expense, rather than that cash expense, and spread that over the life of an asset. That's what accrual accounting does, and we're not even looking at the right numbers. So I'll stop there. I've got my point in on accrual accounting, and we'll come back to other things in terms of waste, in terms of the effect on households in terms of prices, I'm sure in Q&A. Well, thank you.
There are seats up front. Please come and take a minute to come up to this. About 10 seats up here, so. Oh, and thank you for moving over. That's very kind of you.
You better be a podcast.
Yes, sir. Okay. That's all right. I'll wait for everyone to be seated. Yep. All right, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's hard to believe there's this much interest in development charges, but Enid was right about one thing, and that is development charges seem to be in the news more and more and more now, more than ever before, as far as I can tell. And so I do agree this is a timely event. So I'm going to take, obviously, a different direction compared to the one that Ben took, and I will do my very best to do this in 10 minutes. It's a very complex topic, but we'll see how well I can do. While I uphold a promise I made to Enid and Cass that I do two things with my presentation. I have no graphs, I have no numbers or formulas, and I won't use dense economic jargon. And for a professional economist like myself, that's a bit of a challenge. So I'll see how I make out. So I won't spend a lot of time on this side because Enid, I think, did a lot of the heavy lifting for me in talking about what development charges are, what they do, how they function. I will note, though, that MFOA did a study in 2019 which examined development charges throughout Ontario, where they're levied, and really looked at a very simple metric, which is how much of housing prices do they account for? Because you think that's a relevant number, right? Because what we keep hearing is that they're making housing unaffordable. Well, what is that range? 5 to 7%. Maybe that's changed a little bit since. I'm not sure. Both development charges rates and housing prices have gone up quite a bit since then. So I don't know what the number is now, but that I would argue that's a relatively small number. And then, of course, our colleagues at AMO and MFOA would both give the same message to us on this topic, and that is that development charges are essential to adhering to this principle that growth should pay for itself. All right, so Ben touched on this slide a little bit, but I'll go into some more detail on it. So upfront expansion is necessary when it comes to municipal services. I don't think anybody argues against that. But what I want to do at this point, though, is walk through the 3 reasons why this happens, and then I'll talk about why that has implications on the financing side. So we have engineering reality, we have legal constraints, and we have cost factors. So engineering reality, that's going to speak to things like bridges, roads, traffic signals, things that give you all or nothing capacity. So think of a lane of road. You can't build a partial lane of a road. So as your municipality grows gradually, at some point you have to build an entirely new lane, and probably on both sides of the road. You can't build a partial lane. So you have this issue of all or nothing capacity for a number of assets. For other assets like landfills and water treatment plants, there are regulatory restrictions which force municipalities to expand those assets well before their capacity is consumed. And then finally, you have cost factors. So a great example here is a trunk sewer. We know that it makes no sense to install a trunk sewer and then come back 2 years to replace it, to incrementally increase it for growth, and then come back 2 years later and do it again. That makes no sense. So what do we do instead? Well, what we do is we try to forecast what that ultimate need is for the sewer in that road, and then build the sewer to that size, to that capacity. And that often means a huge amount of excess capacity has to be built up front. So you might ask, well, what's the issue with that, right? So what if municipalities have to build these things up front? Well, the issue is that when you go to calculate efficient property taxes and user fees, they must be based on full utilization of that capacity. And if you want to reassure yourself of that fact, think of a municipality that doesn't grow and a municipality that is exactly at full capacity. It will have a tax rate, it will have a user fee rate. those rates will be efficient because they will exactly deliver the service that's required and they will exactly recover the costs that are required. So those are the efficient rates. As soon as that municipality grows, it gets into this trouble of having to finance all this infrastructure up front that's going to build all this capacity up front that will not be taken up for potentially decades. So what that means is that municipalities then, for long periods of time, have to carry this excess capacity. That excess capacity has major costs associated with it. Even if you do what Ben says, which is you finance the project entirely by debt, you still have this issue of having to carry those costs year after year after year, waiting for the growth to occur that is going to pay for it. And that's where we get into some trouble. Because growth doesn't occur all at once, it's necessarily the case, and you can prove this mathematically, it's not hard, it's necessarily the case that those efficient property taxes and user fees will not fully recover the costs. They just won't. There's going to be a gap. And again, the gap relates to the fact that the infrastructure has to be built up front, but the growth takes time, even decades, to materialize to take up that capacity. So what are municipalities supposed to do while they're waiting for growth to come along and start to pay property taxes and user fees? Well, one thing they could do is just simply do what Ben and others are suggesting, is simply raise property taxes and user fees. That's what you could do. The problem with that is if you're starting at an efficient level and you raise those taxes and fees, then you're necessarily levying inefficiently high taxes and fees. And that has all kinds of issues. So I list them here and I'll go through them briefly. So the first issue is there's an inequity that necessarily shifts the growth-weighted costs to existing ratepayers. There's no escaping that. That's exactly what will happen. But then we have to think about, well, how will those existing ratepayers respond to this impact? And you don't have to be an economist to understand that, well, they're going to respond the same way that anybody else responds when they face a price increase. They're going to consume less. So in this case, they would call for lower service levels. And they actually can do something else in addition to that, which you can't really do in a marketplace, and that is call on their municipal politicians to enact greater restrictions on development. You can see what the impact of that is going to be. And so in the papers that Enid mentioned, I give this impact a name. I call it the externality of excess capacity, because that's really where it comes from, excess capacity. So you'll notice that so far I've really gone through this presentation without saying anything about development charges. So now I'll finally tell you what development charges are and what they're meant to do. So I talked about how municipalities, if they're growing and if they want to keep service levels constant, then they will necessarily have a revenue shortfall if they levy efficient property taxes and user fees. So the question is, how will they make up that shortfall, understanding it is purely driven by growth? It would not exist but for growth. So that's where development charges come in. The whole point of development charges is when they're properly formulated, they will plug that gap. So they will recognize that when growth occurs, it will start to pay property taxes and user fees. And so that would become a deduction from what would otherwise be a development charge, but there will be that residual amount of cost that needs to be recovered, and that's what development charges do. And so in this sense, they resolve that externality of excess capacity that I referred to earlier, and this is how development charges work in conjunction with property taxes and user fees, not as a replacement of them. So I'll just quickly conclude here on the merit of development charges. So again, you can show this mathematically. It's not very hard, that efficient property taxes and user fees will necessarily leave a portion, not all, but a portion of growth-related capital costs unrecovered. So we have to figure out, how do we plug that gap? You could do it by increasing property taxes and user fees, but again, that takes you away from efficiency, causes inequities, and potentially leads to a very counterproductive cycle in that you actually get less housing built. You get less development occurring because of this issue. And so development charges are a way to, again, plug that gap, avoid that problem. And that's not to say that development charges today in Ontario are properly calculated in the way that I have outlined here. But it does go to say that there is a role for development charges. And it's up to us, I think, as a province to really figure out how can we fine-tune the legislation to ensure that development charges serve the role that they're intended to do. So, Enid, am I on time?
Time, thank you.
Okay.
And you stuck to one of your promises. You said you'd have no numbers, but you also said you wouldn't use any economics jargon. I think you used a little.
I said dense. I said dense jargon.
Oh, dense jargon. Anyway, thank you. With Ben and Adam, and then you have a chance to ask questions as well. But I guess I want to start with, I did offer Ben a little rebuttal here, because, originally I asked Ben and Adam who wanted to go first, and Ben said I should toss a coin. The problem with that, of course, is we have to line up the slides in advance, so we couldn't do that. But you ended up going first, so if you wanted to just comment a little bit on what Adam has said.
So I think we'll get into a question about the effect on housing prices.
Yeah.
So I'm going to reserve on that. But I want to talk about why I agree with a key point that Adam makes about the externality of excess capacity. It's a really important one. And one of the things that I think about is kind of, hopefully this is too much jargon, but like kind of optimal capital financing. And in the same way that you would never want a household to go into buying a house with 100% debt. Like that's terrible. That's a terrible way to finance your house purchase. It's a terrible way to finance a water treatment facility for a city. You don't want to have 100% equity finance as well. Development charges to me sound a heck of a lot like equity finance, where someone like you as a resident of the city effectively own your asset as a resident of your city. So when I think of an externality, as to use this economic jargon, what that means is a third party has to come in and fix it. When it's greenhouse gas emissions, government has to put in place a price or a limit on how much we emit. But when we talk about the externality of excess capacity, and we're focusing just on property taxes, user fees, or debt finance is something that you as a resident have to pay for every single year in terms of your debt charges. There's another group that can come in, and it's equity finance. And I'm not talking about private investment necessarily. We can have equity finance, equity structure at the municipal level. We see this with electricity companies. We see this with the province, the federal government, taking an equity stake and looking at the long-term profits that can come from an asset once it's fully paid off. Once it's gotten to the point of growing, to be full utilization. And then this goes back to a reason why I separate water from all the other some of the other conversations. Because water, we have that model. We can do it. It works internationally. We're effectively at full user pricing. And we can pay for these kinds of long-term water assets. To solve Adam's key point with a different way in which we just finance things every single year.
Okay. Thank you. I did want to give you that opportunity, and I think you both agree on water, but I'm not going to go back and forth on this one. I'm going to ask a different question. So when I started, I said development charges were in the news because of housing affordability issues. And recently we saw the federal minister say to a municipality in British Columbia, we're not going to give you your housing accelerator funds because your development charges are too high, and that's affecting the cost of housing. So let's unpack this. Are development charges making housing less affordable?
The honest answer is we don't know right now. And the reason why we don't know is because development charges are not properly calculated right now. And I go back to the Ontario Development Charges Act and the two glaring omissions that are in that act. So one is, well, not so much an omission on one end, two, let's say, shortcomings of that act. One is that, and goes to your point about what happened in 1997. All of these deductions got put in, all these restrictions got put in, which watered down how much municipalities could collect. But the other issue with the act is that it doesn't recognize the user fees and property taxes that growth will pay once it's here, and deduct that from what would otherwise be recoverable from development charges. And these are offsetting effects. So the answer is we actually don't know, because development charges are not properly calculated right now. But assuming they were, I make the argument in the 2021 paper I wrote for IMFG that they actually enhanced housing affordability. Even though they do lead to an increase in housing prices, they enhance affordability because they decrease property taxes and user fees to such an extent that your combined bill as a homeowner is actually lower with development charges. So I would argue that when they're properly formulated, they actually make housing affordability better as opposed to worse.
So you're saying we can't just look at development charges, we have to look at all of the costs that the homeowner is paying for local services and look at it that way?
Absolutely, and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation agrees with that, because they look at property taxes and other costs that are directly associated with home ownership or with rental of housing, and they look at those costs as being part of the bundle of housing costs. And so yes, housing affordability includes more than just the price of housing.
So I think that's really worth unpacking. This is a really important point. And distinguishing the effect of development charges on price, which I think we can agree on. I think we can agree that there is an effect on price. Now the question becomes, what's the effect on value? Because all this infrastructure that was notionally attached, that is not notionally, is attached to these development charges, they get built. They will get built eventually. It is a liability on every municipal balance sheets. To me, the question becomes the distinction between government as a long-lived, hopefully, fingers crossed, lasting, effectively an infinite amount of time, versus a household that is only going to be in the community for a certain amount of time. It's only going to be alive for a certain amount of time. And it comes down to a deep question about the time value of money. And the value that a municipal government places on infrastructure that's in place at a certain point is going to be different than that household that's got a much more limited time frame in terms of how it thinks about its use of that capital. So I think that's really important to distinguish. And so even if in the lifetime of that asset, yes, the price of this this nice park or better roads is embedded in the value of all these assets is embedded in the price. What are the consequences of that higher price? In a era in which households face high interest costs, where they're constrained by their mortgage payments, higher prices, even though they're getting higher value, means that their family is left out of the housing market. It means that people who want to buy now, they value these nice things, but they can't pay for it all right here up front. They want to pay for it over time. These development charges that have this effect of increasing upfront prices for long-term assets that we do value, it ends up leaving people out of the market. And that's the crux of the fairness issues around development charges that I think we have to really think about.
But isn't it true that when you pay for your house, when you buy your house and includes the development charges, that you take out a mortgage and spread those costs over time?
You do, but what we're talking about is what is the capacity of that household to take on that debt. We live in a world in which there are OSFI regulations in terms of how much what you're limited in terms of what you can borrow. That affects your down payment that you can have. So when we accept the very first principle that development charges have an upfront effect on price that is paid for now by households, there's a consequence to that of people left out of the market. There's a consequence of people who want to buy a house or rent a house, and the rental, we're going to get into rental exemptions as well. But when DCs on rental, when they're there, they get passed on through rents as well. So when we accept that there is a pass through in some capacity of higher price, even though it comes with higher value, that means that some people are left out of the market, and there's social consequences to that.
There's also consequences to excessively high property taxes and user fees.
So
the household's not going to distinguish they're not going to distinguish the mortgage payment, the property taxes, the user fees. They're all part of the cost of living in a community, right? So they're going to feel those the same way. Right?
Yeah, agreed
So
with the sorry.
So I would suggest, again, and I think I show this in the paper, that if you have properly formulated development charges and you just get rid of them, what's going to happen is that property taxes and user fees will go up by so much that households will in fact be worse off, even though they're not paying development charges anymore. That households collectively, everyone collectively will be worse off.
Yeah, I think that would be true if households and municipal governments had the exact same equivalent value on time. And I think municipal governments or utilities that think about, can think multi-generationally, they should be thinking multi-generationally, can make these investments for the long term in a way that households can't.
So let's move on to something else we read about a lot. Adam, you had it in one of your slides. Growth should pay for growth. Let's unpack that one. What does that even mean? And why should growth pay for growth?
Yeah, well, there's really two reasons why. The first reason is to maintain efficiency, right? So the idea is to make sure that, again, we keep property taxes and user fees at efficient levels. The only way you can, or a necessary condition of doing that, is making sure that growth pays for itself. The other reason to do it is an equity reason, and that is to make sure that growth is not a burden on the existing community and vice versa. I mean, that's really the whole idea, right? And so when we say growth should pay for growth, what we're really saying is we understand that growth will come and that when it comes, it will pay property taxes and user fees. However, because of the way things work with upfront capital, and as I went through that whole story in my slides, that means there's going to be a revenue shortfall. And so that means we've got to complement the property taxes and user fees with development charges to close the gap, and that way we make sure growth pays for itself through a combination of things. Property taxes and user fees once it arrives, and development charges at the time that it's built.
Do we have any sense of, and Ben, I'll turn to you in a minute, do we have any sense of what portion of that infrastructure is paid for by growth? It's certainly not 100% through development charges. Any sense of, I mean, in other words, some of that infrastructure is still being paid for by existing residents?
Yes, it is. At least since 1997, those measures have been in the Development Charges Act, which reduce cost recovery from growth. I don't have a firm number in that regard, but I can try to put it into some context on what would the levy increase be, percentage-wise, if development charges were just eliminated. In places like Halton Region, where there's a lot of reliance on development charges, you're probably looking at levy increases that are in the 25-30% range.
Property tax.
Yes, that would be immediate today. So if development charges are eliminated today, in order for the municipality to be financially soluble, it would have to raise property taxes likely in that range, which I would argue is a substantial increase, because not only does it apply that year, it will apply forever, right? It will be there forever.
Ben, should growth pay for growth?
So let me talk practical and then theoretically. So first on the practical point, there are metrics that we have in the Development Charges Act in terms of a discounting of saying this is the amount that we assume is for growth, this is for how much existing users benefit from it. It's made up as far as I can tell in terms of what the metrics are. It makes no sense. And so practically, I don't even know how you do this in terms of saying this is a growth-related asset, this is for existing users. I just don't think you can practically do it. But the other point I would make is that let's look at, again, this is what debt is for. Debt, equity finance. Like I look at like the city of Epcor, city of Edmonton, which owns Epcor, which thinks about long-term assets in terms of how it's going to invest in water and wastewater infrastructure. It's looking at that long-term. It's knowing that the growth will pay for itself through, for example, debt finance. And we want to use debt finance to pay for something when we know it's going to grow. When it's going to grow, when the services and benefits that we're going to get from them are going to grow at more than the interest rate that we're going to have to pay for them, or the cost of capital for that equity ownership. We want that. We want to pay for things that are going to grow. over time when our capacity to pay for those things is going to grow. That's kind of the premise of economic growth. And hence, that's how I think of how growth pays for growth. It's over the life in which we're going to see that benefit.
Can I address that? I just need to, because I think there's actually quite an overlap in terms of agreement here. So you might ask the question, why does this externality of excess capacity not afflict business corporations? Right? So you never heard me say Starbucks has this problem, McDonald's has this problem, or even developers have this problem. I'm not saying anything about that, right? So you might ask, what is so different about municipalities that causes this problem to arise? Well, the issue, and this goes to something Ben mentioned a minute ago, sort of subtly, but it's a very important point. And that is that municipalities right now cannot raise equity. They are not business corporations. So you cannot go to the City of Toronto and say, can I buy some shares, please? I'd like to be an equity investor in your corporation. The city is going to laugh you out of City Hall because that's not possible right now. So municipalities are not business corporations, so they cannot raise equity. So then you have to wonder, well, who are the municipalities' investors then, right? Like, municipalities are corporations, so who would be their investors? Who are the shareholders of municipalities? And it's the property owners. That's effectively who the shareholders are. And so then what you're asking through development charges, effectively what you're asking of the property owners is, hey, if you want to be part of our corporation, you have to buy some shares, right? You have to put some equity into the game. And I think that's what you're talking about. And so if municipalities were business corporations, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? You wouldn't need to have development charges because they can raise equity. So I think that's a challenge. And that's why I wanted to bring that subtle point to the surface, because I think it's a very important point to make. And it's an area where we agree. So I agree with Ben that if wastewater services were delivered by business corporations as utilities, you wouldn't need to have development charges.
Yeah, and so this is
okay.
30% of the charges.
So this is a really important conceptual breakthrough for people to wrap their heads around. If you do that, if you go down this route, you've effectively cut development charges in most of the 905 in half. And that's where a whole chunk of the development charge problem is. That's where a lot of the growth is going. Now, then you get into breaking down, are development charges the right way to pay for some of the other assets, some of the other things? Now we get to the housing conversation, where one of the big debates in Bill 23, for example, was the Bill 23 removed the ability for cities to have housing services as a development charge eligible service. So now this goes to the question of what's the right way of paying for housing services. I would argue the best way to do that is on the broadest tax base as possible. It's through income taxes, through progressive income taxes in particular, where this is the societal bargain that we've come up with, is that we pay for the services of people who need it the most from higher income people. And I wouldn't say that putting that on the Development Charges Act, or the development charges, is a direct way to that. Like, let's go after income, go after other ways of paying for that kind of key social infrastructure. So once you've dealt with housing, you're kind of down to things like police and fire, where in terms of other basic municipal services, where I kind of go back to the point of how do you separate the broad social benefit, municipal-wide benefit of police, and say, oh, only these people here benefit from the new investment versus these people. At that point, these are just fully socialized benefits that all people in the city benefit from.
Okay, I just want to very briefly
audience.
address that. So I've heard this argument a number of times, and I don't believe it to be valid, that you cannot disentangle growth-related needs from existing needs. It's just simply not true. So just imagine this thought experiment. With any piece of infrastructure, you ask the question, would we build this to the capacity we're building it if we weren't growing? If the answer is no, then it has a growth share. And it's not, and I know we've got some people that are much more skilled than myself. Gary Scanlon's here, for instance. He's well-versed in this, how you attribute those costs to existing development versus growth. So I don't like to pretend that it's some kind of impossible exercise.
Okay,
it's done all the time.
I have lots of questions,
Okay.
but I'm going to turn it to the audience. I have a question up
Okay.
front and one over here. Do we need microphones, or we just, oh yeah, we got a microphone coming. Come this way.
Cass?
There.
So great to see you both. So my question is, I'm going to give you a high-level question, and then I'm going to give you some detail.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, so make it
I will be quick.
succinct.
So which is more important, fairness or functionality as a principle for development charges? And the reason I ask this is, as a municipality gets better, the cup that they can kind of fill in the water of development charges or their level of service goes up. And therefore, the per capita charge that they charge goes up. But it's almost a flat tax. It doesn't matter what your ability to pay is. You all owe whatever the amount is per person, and that kind of gets rolled into a charge per house based on the number of people who live in that house. But it's agnostic to people's ability to pay. Yet, when we look at other things, other services that we fund in society, we understand that that needs to be based on people's ability to pay because there's a functionality argument. So what do you guys think
Okay,
of
so
that?
the question is about what, the development charges are not based on ability to pay. Other services are.
Well, I would just start off by saying most other services are not, actually. Most other services are financed by property taxes, and property taxes aren't based on ability to pay. That's one of the hallmarks of property tax, right?
Yeah.
So I would say there's not much of a distinction between property taxes and development charges in this regard. Neither of them are based on ability to pay.
So I'm sorry, I'm talking about like
Okay.
hospitals, schools, like the broad spectrum of services we expect from a government, right? You're talking about just the municipality and the way they.
That's what I
but
thought
I'm
we were talking about.
The broad spectrum of things that we expect from our government, other than municipalities, is based on ability to pay. Like at the provincial and federal level, that is the concept. And
So I think
services.
I think what you get is just the messy reality of a little bit of both, which is that we don't live in a world in which we perfectly finance all of our infrastructure, and where we are probably vacillates between where the greatest demands are. Like right now, the urgent societal issue is getting more housing built, so we're probably going to be focused, leaning in that direction. That's where we'll probably go. The pendulum will swing back at some other point, and it'll be a messy reality based on what society wants. That's democracy, folks.
Okay. Bill, anything on you? I think you need the mic because we're video.
Hello? Yes. So it's,
Choose your words wisely.
So municipalities access capital more cheaply than households. And when you use development charges, the financing cost of the externality of excess capacity is on the households, and when you use property taxes, it's on the municipality. Is it sensible to have a third way in between those two, which is a property tax of 20 or 30 years that only applies to new builds, which is financed through the municipality?
So I'm kind of partial to that in a sense of that would work in theory. The question becomes in practice because, so now this neighborhood is going to get that rate. Then that neighborhood is going to get that rate. Then that neighborhood is going to get that rate. And then, but 5 years later, people who are there go, what the heck? Why are they paying that much? So it just becomes a kind of messy reality where I wish that worked in theory. I just think the political reality wouldn't work. I think you have to just socialize as much as possible.
A question at the back. You don't need to answer.
Nope. No. Don't need that.
Thank you.
I agree with you.
Thank you for that. This one's for Adam. Adam, you seem to suggest that, I guess it's not clear that DCs, like that balance between DCs and property taxes is in any way skewed one way. I guess based on data I've seen on DCs comprising like 25%-ish of housing costs, and property taxpayers in Toronto and maybe a few other municipalities being undertaxed. My conclusion based on that data would be that property taxes are too low and DCs are too high. So just curious to.
In Toronto, you're talking about Toronto specifically?
Let's talk about Toronto.
Yeah, that may be the case. I think IMFG has talked a lot about property taxes in Toronto specifically, and about whether residential property taxes here specifically are too low. I'm not entirely sure, but I think there's some evidence to suggest that maybe they are relative to non-residential. But to your question about is there an imbalance between DC development charge rates and property tax rates in Toronto? Again, I can't look at that data. That data that you just described doesn't give me enough information to know. I need to know what went into the calculations to determine whether, first of all, development charges were properly formulated, and then are the rates being applied that reflect that formulation? And then I would have to also look at the property tax side to see what is going on there. So I just don't think that sort of surface observation gives us enough information to make a strong inference one way or the other.
Any questions?
So you've mentioned a few times that development charges to be calculated correctly. Is that even a possibility with the legislation that's currently out there right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is no. It's simple no.
You can expand.
You can't. Okay. No, well, yeah, and I do talk about this in the papers that there's really two things that need to be fixed with respect to the DC Act if you want it to do what I think it should do at least. One is to get rid of all of the exemptions, get rid of all the discounts, get rid of every measure that is designed to reduce cost recovery. And then what we should also do is add in provisions that recognize that when growth occurs, it will pay property taxes and user fees. And so that forecasts that are done in development charges studies would then account for those anticipated revenues and when they would occur. And that those would then would become a discount to DC rates, right? Because it's a recognition that growth will pay for, it will recover some of the costs that are attributable to growth, but just not all of them. And so whatever falls out the bottom end will be what is recovered by development charges. So that's, in a nutshell, what I think needs to be done to make the legislation align with the theory that I've laid out for development charges.
And I do think that aligns with the key point that we kind of agreed on earlier, which is that things that you can have done outside of municipal government, like water and wastewater, leave that to a private business to come up. What we're talking about is effectively trying to come up with that calculation, but in government regulations, right? That's leave that to a business to figure out what is the max, the proper way to do it. And they create a regulator for water and wastewater. So topic for another day, but that's the path to go down for water and wastewater.
Okay.
Lots to go after.
Dog with a
We're going
bone.
to take two more questions, one here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
It's on.
Hi, my name is Saad Ahmed, and I'm from tiny Toronto. And I specifically have a question regarding the garden suites that have been upzoned in the whole province that makes millions of backyards eligible. Could you give some insight on how would you recommend development charges to the 400 plus municipalities in Ontario?
Sorry, I don't think I caught the whole
But
question.
garden
Garden
suites, like
suites,
additional
what do you-
units.
Yeah, what do you do with development charges?
I'll let Ben go first on this one.
So that's a tricky one where, on the one hand, I get that there are more people. There are more every time that you have more people in an asset, using existing assets. They create a draw, and yet there is a societal benefit to increasing the utilization of low density housing. We want to get more housing built. So there's a dilemma here. So my solution would be to get as much as we can off the development charge base and make as much of the stuff that would, in theory, lead to a higher property value, another effective house there, paying for these assets, these benefits through higher property taxes, through user fees. That's where we want to pay for it. And in the interim, finance what we need to in terms of more density, better services to serve that higher density through debt.
Okay, last question here.
I was curious, Adam, for your comment. You mentioned that if these services were delivered more like a business or with an equity perspective, what do you see as the potential there for municipal services corporations or similar entities in Ontario and elsewhere?
All right, I'll try to give the short answer to that question, because it's a very good question, and you could write books on this stuff. So I think that the golden rule here is if it's a service that whose beneficiaries are hard to identify, then it makes sense that it's a public service delivered by a municipality. So things like parks, roads, things of that nature, right? So I think those are the services where probably you're going to leave them within the municipal sphere. So they would continue to be subject to development charges. The services that are ideal for business corporations are ones that have the opposite attribute. And that's where you can identify the beneficiaries specifically, you can charge them, and you can recover costs and all that. And one great example of that is water and wastewater. It's very clear who's using the service, how much they're using it. It's relatively straightforward to charge them for the service and recover costs. And if it were run as a business corporation as opposed to a municipality, you have the market open to you for equity, and you can raise equity, and you don't have to have development charges. So those would be the kinds of services that I think fall into that category. There may be some other ones that are a little grayer, but I think water, wastewater is pretty clear that you could do that. I'm not saying it necessarily should be done. I think it's up to each municipality to decide. I wouldn't force it, but it can be done. And Ben's right, it's been done all over the world.
And electricity in Ontario. Electricity, and all I'm really asking for is that we treat water effectively the same way we do with electricity, where 99% of cities in Ontario, they're owned by their municipal government. There are very few small examples where, at least where it's not Hydro One, in terms of a public entity. That's another topic. That's a topic for another day. But most other cities, they have a municipally owned electricity corporation in which there is effectively this conversation about what's their equity value.
Well, that hour went by quickly, didn't it? And we actually ended up on an agreement, and it was supposed to be a debate. But that's okay. We don't agree on everything, but we agree on something. We promised a lively but friendly debate. I think we've achieved that. We still have 2 more topics that we're going to convene on in the future that you've raised. But I hope you, the audience, have gotten a better understanding of some of the issues around development charges. I'm tempted to do a straw poll of who are for them and who are against them. I'm going to pass on that because we are being video recorded.
I have votes planted out there. Come on.
Well, we are being video recorded, and so you might not want to put up your hand. But to say that this, the slides will be available on our website, and the video recording will take a little bit longer, but it will be on our website and also on YouTube. So thank you to our presenters.
Thank you. Thank you all. Well done, sir. Well done.
Hey, well done.
And they ended up friends. And thank you all for coming and showing an interest in this topic. And I hope to see you all again soon.
There you go.
Thank you.